Well, again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and share the work that I've been doing around burnout experiences in accessibility specialists. I am an assistant professor in computer science at Bucknell University, a small college in central Pennsylvania in the US. And I did this work jointly with one of my students who just graduated, Alexa Horvath. And first, I'd like to take a moment, thank the National Science Foundation and Bucknell that helped fund this work, and also point you to a couple of links. So there is burl.live, L-I-V-E, /burnout, and that is a connection form if you're interested in getting the extended paper on this work when we publish it, or just staying in contact for some of our future work as we continue to explore this and related areas, as well as burl.live/slide, singular, SLIDE, all lowercase, for the slides for this presentation. And I think it captures it really well that kind of the subtitle of this presentation is actually a quote from one of our interviewees who said, I need help, exclamation point, smiley point, like smiley face. We're all trying so hard and we want to do so well, but like, haha, slightly drowning here, but trying to keep up a good look. So uh, diving into it then. Oh, maybe. First, a little bit of background on the project, because I think it is a lot of very indicative of why we ended up looking here as to how prevalent this experience is. But we actually first started with a project that was in a completely different area. It was about actually some of what we were talking about at the end of the last talk, of collaboration between developers and designers and accessibility specialists, and how does that collaboration happen? And we just happened to start by interviewing accessibility specialists. And the interviews were an hour long, and for 45 minutes, very standard professional interview about their tasks and their problems and their tools and things like that. And without prompting, almost all of them in the last 15 minutes just decomposed into this venting therapy session, essentially, is when my colleagues joked about, of just how hard everything was and how ready they were wanting to quit, and what tensions they were having with all the people they were working with and all these assholes that they had to deal with every day, and just the sheer amount of exhaustion that was happening. And so we really started to identify that there was this kind of interesting space where when they talked about the work and why they got into it, it was really meaningful and important, and they were so passionate about it. But at the same time, again, these feelings of exhaustion and stress and being deflated and undervalued really, again, just started to pop up from these, again, broader discussions that I was just kind of asking about their workflow. And so that really drove us wanting to dive into this idea of understanding the accessibility specialist burnout experience. We wanted to ask questions like, do accessibility specialists experience burnout? In what ways? How does that compare to other domains? And is there anything unique about this experience that we can identify? Really with the goal of hopefully informing how we better support people in the future. And so we did that by drawing from a lot of other areas. So we draw a lot from psychology, from studies of burnout in other disciplines, from studies of burnout in the tech field. A lot of prior work has really focused on care workers like nurses and teachers and firefighters, kind of human care workers, and really kind of understanding what the state of our understanding of burnout collectively is. And from there, developed a survey that we sent out to accessibility specialists, trying to, again, get a little bit more specific about their experience to complement these interviews where we had these really rich concepts coming up, but since they were unprompted, they were a lot more all over the place. And so first, just to get us all on the same page, thinking about what is our definition of burnout. And while we might use it colloquially of feeling like, oh, I'm burned out, really our understanding of it is that it is not this binary of either you're burned out or you're not. You're thriving or you're like what? it's really more of this interaction or relationship between a person and their work in this case, and the environment that goes around with it. So this exchange of components in their workplace and in their larger ecosystem is really what we think about when we think about burnout. And in particular, we drew from what's called the Maslow Burnout Inventory, which is a standardized measure of burnout. So we were able to do more comparisons with it, and it breaks down burnout into three main components. High cynicism, which is that feeling of hopelessness and detached and like the pessimism that goes along with it. High exhaustion, and when we think about exhaustion, we're thinking about physical as well as mental and emotional depletion. And low professional efficacy. That is, people begin to lose confidence in their ability to do their jobs or to do their jobs well under these conditions. And again, these all contribute to these overall feelings of burnout or distress in this case, the workplace environment. And we really start to see burnout over time where people have these moments of high exhaustion, high cynicism, right, demands on their work, and do not have the appropriate time or resources to recover. So it is the pressure and the lack of recovery. And so when we were first looking at this, again, our first question was, are accessibility specialists even burned out? And colloquially, we knew just from talking to people, but what do the measurements actually say? And we did find that compared to measures of the general population, of the 28 people we surveyed, so they were significantly higher in their cynicism, so an indicator of burnout, significantly higher in their exhaustion, but actually lower as far as burnout goes. They had higher professional efficacy, which low efficacy is usually one of the measures of a distressed profile. So really we're seeing people who are tired and cynical, but they believe that they can do a good job. They just, because of other factors, aren't able to achieve that goal or use those talents. And as we further dug into whether or not this experience of burnout was unique to accessibility specialists, or there was something unique about accessibility specialists versus just we're all flailing under capitalism and everybody's tired and overwhelmed and doesn't know what to do. One component we were drawn to were these burnout profiles that came out of some of that same research in general burnout. And so they kind of profile these almost spectrum of burnouts of engaged, which again, we might consider not burned out at all, where you've got low exhaustion, low cynicism, and high efficacy. You can do your job and you're excited about it. Then they had what they profiled as ineffective, where you're tired and cynical and not very good at your job or don't feel good at your job. So really just not getting things done and not personally well. There's this overextended profile in which you have high exhaustion, but actually you aren't too cynical about it, right? It's just you just have too much to do, and so it starts to decrease your ability to do the job well, as opposed to disengaged, where maybe somebody isn't as tired or exhausted, but they're highly cynical, right? They don't think they can do their job well, and they no longer believe in the work that they're doing. And then the profile that fell under this of how they defined burnout was kind of the most extreme version of this, again, with the tired and cynical and low efficacy. But what we found was, again, on average, the accessibility specialists, again, over the 26 we surveyed, they fell into a couple different categories, but they also fell into this one that's not well represented in these burnout profiles of being high in exhaustion and high in cynicism, but still really think that they can do the job well, right? That belief that we are skilled. And this even from people that we're discussing at how, they wish they had more education or felt thrown in the deep end, they still recognize that they had the capacity to improve accessibility. And that actually comes into play in some of the other nuances we get into a little later. So now we kind of broaden out into the what is actually affecting people's experience of burnout. And actually, sorry, let me go back as I just caught a question that's very specific to this data. for that significance. So for all of these components, they are statistically significant for our sample size. Again, we had a sample of 28, so there is a significant difference as compared to the general population. But again, with the caveat that, 28 is not a large sample, so it's statistically valid to say that this group of people was significantly different, but we can have the discussion around, right, the generalizability. And then another caught the asterisks that I missed taking out, and that was just because in these models, these statistically validated models of burnout, they found that professional efficacy did not influence, was not as statistically meaningful a contributor when they're looking at these different profiles as compared to cynicism and exhaustion, which might be why they didn't have a specific profile around this high, but they still included it as the pattern was there. It's just the power of that factor in their analysis was not as strong. So that was what the asterisk looked like. So again, going now into thinking about what is contributing to this system of burnout. And we went through the interviews and classified them as well as some of the open-ended survey results to really try to get a sense of what was contributing to people's experiences. And we broke it down into 3 categories. So thinking about, right, this burnout experience or workplace experience in that center, and that cynicism, exhaustion, and efficacy are affected by personal factors, work factors, and environmental factors. And when we say personal, we're thinking of things like values and identity and skills and general mentality. When we're talking about the work, we're thinking of the job tasks, the actual day-to-day labor that somebody is doing, as well as potentially how that aligns with what their position formally says or their understanding of what work they are supposed to be doing versus are being requested to do. And the environment. And this can be at those different scales of the immediate environment of somebody's team in the workplace, their organization, the professional community of accessibility specialists, and their personal environment and influences. And so throughout this, we also saw, again, one of these driving narratives to keep in mind as we dig into some of these factors of a lot of like what drove people into this field, which is this flow of personally feeling that accessibility is a moral imperative. We must do it because it's a good thing to do. And so, right, therefore, any efforts to improve accessibility is doing good. Combine that with the high professional efficacy, so I'm good at my job. Therefore, anytime I make progress in my job, I am doing good in the world. And this value-work connection can be really motivational for people, and again, is indeed why a large number of people end up in accessibility, as caught by this quote of, "I feel I have avoided burnout because I have always had a sense of my own value and the value of the work." And so keeping this narrative in mind as we go through these factors, we'll kind of, get toward the end of seeing how it, again, does influence that actual experience. So diving a bit more into, right, these personal values, again, a lot of people had this inherent belief in the value of accessibility work. Some of that came from a personal connection, whether it was themselves or someone they were close with who had a disability, as reflected in this quote of, "The work has always felt personal. My disability has made me even more focused on the work because I can see more of the ways ableism has harmed myself and my community." And so 2 pieces to already tease out here are, again, the power of that personal connection in driving someone to do this work, but we already see some of the baggage or the weight of that personal connection of starting to tie the work that you're doing into the harm that you're seeing in your community. And we'll see that continue to expand out. But it wasn't just people who had personal connections to disability that really intertwined and had to navigate their identity within accessibility work. Quite a few people who didn't identify as disabled, or particularly those who identified as being in a majority group, also really started to wrestle with what it meant to be an ally, especially in terms of the work. And so here in this quote, to kind of start representing that, is I do not personally identify as having a disability. As a cisgendered white male, I think that's something I struggle with. That you can't have a bunch of folks who don't have a disability pushing this forward. And this is only, a slight snapshot of the conversation we had, and really he was wrestling with this idea of balancing representation matters and making sure that people's voices are lifted who are more directly impacted than he felt he was, while also not overburdening the community or wanting to, right, knowing that we all have to contribute to accessibility in order to advance it forward. And so really trying to find the space of his own identity as an ally, and then again, situating that within the formality of, right, our day-to-day labor and work. Which brings us into this next step of, and a quick aside as I watch the comments come in of someone right saying, if you wear glasses, you're already disabled. And that also came out in interesting ways of when people would identify as disabled versus they're like, well, maybe I'm this, but I'm not affected in, right, maybe I focus on alt text or something like that. And since I don't use it, then I'm not disabled when we're talking about that, right? Identity in this work are really closely tied. And then we also get into the work. And so, right, the work again is that day-to-day and unsurprisingly, just the workload, right? The amount of tasks you have to do in a day came up as an influential factor. But it wasn't just that there were a lot of tasks to do. The nature of the tasks and the environment in which it is done all really contribute to the experience. So for example, quite a few folks brought up this repetitive auditing tasks or repetitive tasks in general. And part of that is the fact, right, that these kind of redundant repetitive tasks can just be more arduous to get through. They don't feel maybe as an opportunity to explore exciting areas, to really re-educate yourself, to get into more systemic problems you might be interested in. But when we also tie this back to the fact that the tasks itself are so closely tied to people's moral narratives that they talk about themselves, the repetitive nature of the task also takes on a moral reflection. So we get quotes like, "We should be better than this by now," and "I'm stuck putting out fires rather than thinking about and creating proactive practices." So not only was the task itself arduous, but to them, right, it mirrored these more systemic problems. So the more they did these repetitive tasks, the more it compounded this feeling of, again, not personal ineffectiveness. They were able to do the tasks, but that they recognized there's this larger system at play that their work does not seem to be contributing to in the ways that people want it to. And this tension with the day-to-day work and the values and goals of specialists continued even as people got into positions where they weren't so much in the day-to-day repetitive auditing. And so one person or a few people we talked to who had gone into management, but one in particular was really reflecting on how as his role changed, he felt even more lost in how to continue to apply his values, especially as he was getting into management. And now, rather than influencing a product, which has a layer of abstraction of the people you're impacting, he was doing this direct person-to-person management, as is captured in this quote where he says, how do I manage disabled people within an ableist system effectively in a way that is ethical? So he found that he had moved from his other people highly invested in accessibility as his peers that he could commiserate with and grow with. And now as their direct manager, had to be the liaison between what the rest of the organization expected of him as a manager and the, again, top-down pressures he was facing. But now all of a sudden, right, he found himself in a position that a step back, he's like, oh, managers have more power. They're often the people who are telling us these things or pushing us or being a factor. Now I've moved up in this system, but I still don't know how to navigate that. And now there's extra pressures and value conflicts that I have to negotiate as I now work as a, right, hierarchically higher or to person in the organization as many of my accessibility peers. Oh, those got backwards. So again, all of these are coming together of these personal values tied in with the day-to-day labor, influenced by the environment around. So again, not surprisingly, a lot of the conversation came into team buy-in. And really what a significant difference it made. Because again, it wasn't just that all repetitive work caused burnout or contributed to negative feelings, as for example, education came up as a thing that people also often felt overworked and overwhelmed by. But if there was appropriate team buy-in, that could mitigate a lot of these pressures, as captured in these quotes of, when I work with a designer who's excited and eager to learn about accessibility, it's an instant boost to my mood and motivation. And another person who said, I'm grateful to be at a place that people believe in the accessibility work we do. They simply don't know how to make the implementations. So these people at this point in their journey were still having to do repetitive work of education, but they found that just the culture change within the organization, that people were invested in learning, was enough to still make that a positive part of their work experience. And then this also built up into the idea of institutional support. Again, thinking about someone's role as they saw it versus the role and actual institutional power that they had. So for example, one individual said, if there aren't leaders in the company stressing the importance and verifying that their people are working on accessibility, we will never get in front of the issue, and that is such a depressing thought. So again, in their role as an accessibility specialist, they were primarily focused in some of these lower level auditing and working team to team, but also felt that they were the ones who, whether directly or indirectly, had to be like the bad guys in the meeting, telling people and verifying that the accessibility they were teaching was happening without any of the institutional power and support that goes with being the one who has to say if things are okay or not. And that not only reflected that the company values conflicted with personal values, but put extra strain on that work. And this idea of different forms of institutional support also came in the form of this relationship to their more direct team. And in this next quote, two things to really keep out for are both the overarching thing of that team support, but also the interpretation of this person of what their job is. So the quote is, right, to help burnout, we need stronger manager support and more realistic expectations, i.e. not assuming a single person or team can change an organization's culture around ableism and accessibility, and that would go a long way. So first of all, again, the idea that accessibility specialists sometimes feel isolated in their endeavors to improve accessibility, and it's not really always institutionally supported in the ways that everyone would like to see. But also in that aside of that, their interpretation of expectations of them is to change the organization's culture around ableism and accessibility. And that's one of the things kind of interesting in digging in more of where that expectation comes from. Is it something explicit? Is it implicit in the fact that in order to get the job done, that are actually the metrics being measured against, the organization needs to change? Or is this more manifesting out of people's interpretation of the job? Because again, they come in and say, I have to change accessibility in order to be good. In order to change accessibility, the institution has to change. If I'm good at this job, I have to change the institution. And especially for entry-level workers, that's already setting up this really challenging mental dynamic of an individual creating institutional change. And so a lot of that kind of compounding into the sense of being valued as a worker, being valued as a professional, and that being reflected in terms of immediate treatment and institutional support of the work. And then kind of the final environment point I want to touch on right now is that of professional community, right? organizations and events like this, where it is accessibility conferences, whether in person, online, informal meetups, more formal presentations, of what an impact that can make in someone's environment. And in, again, if we think about burnout as kind of these stressors without time for recovery, then many people said that engagement in professional community was nice for that recovery portion, right? They are great ways to re-energize, and you create this community where it really starts to break through that isolation to create more of that robustness. So all of these factors are, again, coming together to influence in relationship to one another. Again, burnout isn't just you're experiencing it or you're not, or there's one thing that causes it or not. It's really how an individual doing the work they do in the space that they're doing it, how that reacts and how the environment and the self revolve and evolve with one another to compile into those impacts on cynicism, exhaustion, and efficacy. And again, in particular, thinking about how all of these actually we saw this modification of this personal narrative. So again, we start with a very common narrative of accessibility is morally important. Therefore, improving accessibility does good. And if I'm good at my job, then when I do my job, I do good. Again, a very motivational, personal value work alignment. Again, we saw that actually one of the factors coming into it that I think both has a causal effect as well as reactive effect, evolving as this kind of mental model of one's job and values hits these personal and work and environment factors, this narrative starts to evolve. And so, we start in the beginning of, right, always grounded in that very intrinsic, very core belief that accessibility is a moral imperative. But then we have this minor evolution from now the second step of improving accessibility does good, has that complementary aspect of inaccessibility creates harm. And these are two sides to a similar coin, but we'll see how some of this evolution, again, also contributes to this burnout atmosphere. So now we're at, right, accessibility is important and inaccessibility creates harm. Now, originally, we again tied that to, well, I'm good at my job. But now, right, that extends within this environment to say, I'm good at my job, which also, and I don't have the institutional support that I need. Therefore, if I don't do it, it won't get done, or it won't get done to the level that I could do it at. And that resolves us to a point where originally, right, again, our flow was accessibility is important. Anytime you improve it is good. If I'm good at improving it, I am doing good. 2, accessibility is important. Inaccessibility is harmful. If I don't do it, it won't get done. So if I don't do accessibility, I create harm. And that, again, is a subtle but really impactful narrative change that we saw between some of our participants, where instead of seeing your work as being able to fulfill a moral value every time you did something, you were doing good, to every time you don't do something or something doesn't happen, it's bad, that internal value system has a really big impact on people. And again, we saw this value system modeled in some of our participants. So here are a few more quotes of, right, if I have this knowledge, it'd be really shitty to hoard it. And being accessibility specialists, especially if you have a disability, there's this extra social pressure of if I don't do this, what does that mean? Right? And this kind of existential, what does it mean to me as a person? What does it mean to me and my identities and my core values? And again, this compounding impact of anytime I don't do work, I'm doing harm in the environment in which there is no way that you can do all of the work and do it perfectly. And so now, sorry, there was an extra slide in there I forgot to take out. I want to kind of take us from that narrative And think about, again, one of our goals of understanding the burnout experience was really how might this understanding help us support people? And so one of our first steps was looking at what are mitigation strategies for burnout in general, right? What does a lot of the work say? What does right, the broader world say about burnout? And so one common mitigation strategy that comes up is boundaries, right? So this idea of just say no, really define what is and isn't inside of your control, right? Is kind of this individualistic approach of recognizing the environment around you is suboptimal, and how can you put up protections for yourself so that you can still do work and do good, but maybe start to transition that narrative back to say, if I there is no way in the world that I can do everything, and that's okay. So I can celebrate what I can do and make peace with what I can't. And again, we saw this as a strategy that some people were using and using successfully, or at least partially successfully, right? It had a positive impact, right? Someone saying they developed strategies with their therapist to identify when they needed to step back, or someone stating that they needed to create an emotional distance between myself and my work, time away from accessibility, Slack, LinkedIn, and in particular in that one note, the time away from accessibility. And again, how broad that is, especially when people are so personally connected to it. But right, the idea that taking that step back can be helpful. And then one additional comment in this space was, as a recovering alcoholic, I apply the serenity prayer to my reaction to negative external stimuli. And this was asking about how they dealt with work stress. And for those who don't know, the serenity prayer is, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And there's incredible value, right, in this mentality, in the training and philosophies that people can get through these life experiences, like, right, recovering from addictions or from alcoholism. But I do think it is indicative of something that somebody has to reach into addiction recovery in order to move forward in this job as an accessibility specialist. Like, that seems pretty intense to me. Again, valuable skills, wonderful to be able to apply to broad things, right? That's training and systems working, but wow, to have that on the forefront of your mind when you're thinking about your job. And right, so sometimes, again, people were able to find some boundaries as a useful skill. And sometimes those boundaries did go, right, into more extended barriers, right? Breaks, quitting your job, taking an extended break. And this, again, in the broader burnout literature, is one of the main resolutions between value conflict, where someone's personal values do not align at all with their organization and work values. And if that tension is there, one of the primary ways people solve it is leaving. And we did see that in accessibility specialists. Again, really capturing the scope of this with this quote, I'm going to quit. How can you realistically take on the burden of fighting an ableist system without failing? So again, not only that breaks, again, we had other people who had already said they were taking a break, or knew lots of people who had quit their job recently just to reset and have that recovery. But that, again, some of it stems from just this interpretation of the job as I have to fix the incredibly broken ableist system, as an expansion of, right, the actual job as it's written, and the pressures that form that change. But first of all, this idea of breaks, right? First of all, there's a lot of privilege that go into being able to set boundaries and breaks as to who can afford to do it, who has the power to do it, as well as, right, just being unstable for people who, again, are really excited about this work and want to do it. And it's bad, right, for our accessibility community. That is a lot of a system wherein we haphazardly train people, throw them in, they become really good, and in the process of becoming good, they quit, right? It's unsustainable and obviously very personally unhealthy, but, right, is in the scheme of things. But now I really also want to think about, right, again, who actually can have boundaries and breaks. And I touched a bit on this idea of, right, there's a lot of external factors of institutional support, finances, power as to whether you can take these mitigation strategies, but also this mentality, right? This accessibility is morally important. Inaccessibility creates harm. If I don't do it, it won't get done. If I don't do it, I create harm. Right? How much weight is carried in the idea that if you stop, you are actively doing harm? And we did, again, see this in our interviews with quotes like, I can't turn it off, and I have poor boundaries because if I have this knowledge, it'd be really shitty to hoard it. So any opportunity that is out there, whether it is one that someone asks me for it or I identify in the world, if I see an opportunity where technically I have the skill set to do it and I don't, I am bad. Like, again, whew, that is a heavy thing. And I think that is a lot of what I know me and my journey in accessibility, right? I really struggle with these things that I want to do because I think it's valuable, but right, it's just beyond the capacity. And as another quote captured, combining something I'm extremely passionate about with a dysfunctional organization has completely shattered my ability to mask and regulate my emotions at work. So again, just the essential role that personal identity and values takes in this job and what that actually means as far as how we start thinking about supporting people. And get ahead of myself. I'll finish my slides and then I'll go into my thoughts. Right, so again, thinking about who these people are actually doing this work, right? Who we are doing this work. And what that means for the types of supports needed to do it in a healthy, sustainable way. So another thing, again, that came up was community, right? Can be really powerful for commiseration, for isolation, for refreshing that energy and remembering why we love this work and why it is valuable. But again, this is also a bit of a double-edged sword where you can also get into this space of kind of community burnout, right? What does it mean when every space you go into is carrying the weight of high exhaustion and high cynicism? And spaces that you go to re-energized are themselves so depleted that even engaging in a like-minded community is not recharging. And again, this was captured in one of our quotes. I've noticed that more experienced the accessibility professional, while still very much passionate about getting accessibility done right, are perhaps more cynical, and I just tend to get more deflated around people with those types of attitudes. And this again bringing into what would it mean to balance in our communities and our organizations the obvious benefits of commiseration and acknowledging that this is hard work. We are often put in positions where systemic change is needed to actually see the impact, but people in their positions aren't given the tools to do it, right? I don't want to say that we all need to have this toxic positivity, but this acknowledgement that where do we recharge? How do we again sustain this? I think is a really interesting thing to consider. Again, especially as I present at an accessibility community event. So bringing this all back together, again, just really decomposing this experience of what does it mean to be burned out and how does the accessibility specialist experience compare to that of others? And this ecosystem of factors influencing it, from the deeply personal to the day-to-day work to the relationship with the environment. So some key takeaways and kind of some spaces that this work is going to is this idea that actually a lot of these positions mirror care work a lot more than they mirror tech work. Even though, right, I consider accessibility as a technical specialization or a design specialization, right, similar to security, similar to, right, other things that it is design or development or whatever, plus more knowledge. But that when we look at actually burnout measures and burnout experiences, and Devin Persing also relatively recently put out a book about burnout and accessibility specialists and some of these ideas, and also draws this parallel to care work. of what can we learn by seeing a large component of accessibility work as care work, and how we take care of ourselves and our community, and how our organizations can better support us. And again, breaking down that probably surprised almost no one that accessibility specialists are sad and tired and overworked and underpaid. But by really picking apart what that means, how can that lead us to better support systems? And when I think about support systems, really thinking about, right, all of these different scopes. So again, a lot of the solutions that I touched on today were individual levels. And first of all, that's because of, unfortunately, a lot of the work in burnout has resolved to very either individual mitigation like mindfulness or very vague organizational supports. But I do think that it is still worth talking about individual practices, because I see individual practices as kind of the band-aid we use to keep ourselves together and to support one another, to reinforce our ability to both wait and be agents of organizational change. So I am, again, not saying that burnout is an individual problem. It's very much a systemic problem, but I think there are opportunities for individual practices to help us navigate the world as it exists now. But also then really looking at what are concrete things that organizations can do, that our communities can do, right? That culturally, those shifts, how can that help us better align to do this work and do it well and do it, use that passion that we all feel for it to actually drive us forward. And I like to end with this quote of, this is a cool job and I love doing it. And I think everybody should, but everybody should be empowered to do it because nobody should be burned out or exhausted or underpaid. And so where can we keep that passion and the fact that, right, accessibility does do good in the world? No matter how many roadblocks we hit, we are still, right, agents of our values in the world. And how can we, again, bolster our environment and ourselves to keep that at the forefront and really, really harness that goodness that we're able to do. And so again, I believe I've still got, think about 15 minutes for questions, but again, just wanted to point out, you can get to my slides at burl.live/slide. And to this, if you'd like to stay in contact, either to get our extended paper when it comes out, hopefully soon, or to potentially be part of our advancements in this area, please do fill that form out at burl.live/burnout, BURNOUT, all lowercase. And I am happy to take questions.
Thank you, Annie. That was an excellent presentation. Lots of comments in the chat. We do have 15 minutes for questions. There's a few in the Q&A. Feel free to add more. And then there's a few in the chat as well. So maybe we'll just start just a minor one in the chat. Someone asked on that profile slide what the asterisks mean.
Yeah. So with that one, again, y'all caught that I almost got it all taken care of. I'm almost cool enough to know what slide number it is, but not that cool. Sure, there's a better way to do this. Haha, there is. So in this slide, yes, someone caught that again, that overextended and disengaged, and the efficiency, professional efficiency, efficacy, not efficiency, efficacy, had asterisks. And that, again, those are profiles are drawn from the Mashlow research on burnout. And they were essentially noting that when calculating in their work, if somebody fit in these profiles on thresholds, they didn't consider professional efficacy because it was not a statistically strong a factor as cynicism and exhaustion. So it was not a differentiator. So in those cases, statistically and in the validation of their work, they consider efficacy not as strong a contributor. I kept it in there just so, again, we could see that efficacy does seem to play a role in accessibility specialists as we kind of blend our qualitative and more quantitative understanding. But yeah, the asterisk was just for those that in that official work, they do not consider efficacy scores for overextended or disengaged or burned out, but the asterisk dropped off.
Perfect. And it was just so interesting that the difference in accessibility specialists versus other burnout. So there was a question. Are you familiar with the term vocational awe? As a librarian, I've experienced in myself and coworkers a tendency to shame ourselves when we experience burnout because it feels like a lack of dedication. Do you think this also applies to accessibility specialists?
Absolutely. And I think that that is, again, where we can really start to draw a lot of parallels to care work, right? Like my mom is a nurse and she's like, I can't like just clock out if my replacement doesn't show up, like someone's not going to be cared for. And I think that that high degree of personal intrinsic values tied to our work and how much we do of it, absolutely comes both in terms of how we can step away, but also, yeah, this idea of the amount of shame that people carry of, again, right, that thing of like, if I have this knowledge, it would be shitty to not, or to shitty to hoard it, right? Underlying that is like, anytime I don't do it, I'm a shitty person, right? And there's a lot of external pressure, but also a lot of internal pressure that I think just comes from the level of, right, this works of passion that we've found, um, that don't fit well always into capitalism, but then right, kind of create these cycles of self, right, self-deprecation or self deflating. Absolutely, I think there's a lot of parallels in that.
Awesome. Um, obviously you spent a lot of time researching this and you seem, you're very passionate about it. Is there anything that you want to share that kind of led you to be to do this research and to do this survey and
Yeah, so I think it was a few fold. Part of it, like I mentioned, was just I was interviewing accessibility specialists for other reasons. And after about like, I think I interviewed like 30 people. And, after almost every one of them, a couple in had these breakdowns at the end. And I'm like, I didn't even ask about that. Right? That it is something that's just so seems to really be on the top of everyone's experience. And right, affecting it in a way that it comes out. And it was, again, I started this quite a few years ago, and I know some people were mentioning other talks that have been done at spaces around burnout, and I think the conversation is growing, but it wasn't something I saw talked about a lot. And so some of that drove it. But then another angle is I started as a professor, and I teach a lot of undergraduate students in computer science and related areas. And I was doing an accessibility uh, elective and doing a lot of technical accessibility, but really this disconnect between getting people excited about accessibility work, and then throwing them in a world in which I know they're going to burn, was this real disconnect of like, what skills can we like, advocacy skills are their own thing, right? Are resiliency skills that, again, I hate to phrase it in that kind of individualistic framing, but really like, how can we both get people excited about this space and tap into that passion, um, while still giving them the reality of like, and this is how to balance wanting to do work that you find personally valuable within the limitations of the world. And then finally, again, some of my colleagues always joke with me that I'm doing like this autobiographical work because I'm like laying on the floor being like, why can't I figure out how to publish this paper? Like they just all talk about this angst and they're like, so like you're studying yourself. And I'm like, well, maybe, right? Some catharsis as well as kind of introspection that has come in parallel.
oh yeah, thanks for sharing that. And that's very, I think, relatable to a lot of people. So there's a question here on it's kind of like imposter syndrome. So a tendency to want to know something really well before they teach it to others. And so they feel deflated and overwhelmed because they remember how hard it was for them to learn, and just any kind of tips on overcoming perfectionism, sorry, or overthinking, when teaching accessibility to others. So it's kind of along the lines of what you just said. They're getting someone else excited about it, but then also worrying about not knowing enough to teach. So,
Yeah, I think that it's tricky on a few levels because we did find this, especially like it seems like we're finally at the evolution of digital accessibility where we've got, the old guard who are oftentimes the first accessibility people in their jobs that are kind of at their later stage or end stage careers and kind of people now hopping in at different ranks. But we did hear a lot, like people stumble into this career a lot. And because it has so much informal training, or people are just like winging it, really, some of the quotes I'm seeing in the chat, I think really cover it of like progress over perfection, or something is better than nothing. Or as I tell my students, right, like just starting the conversation can be really good. I was like, yeah, even students that I have trained very specifically and in a very systematic way. I was trying to have one of them like give feedback on alt text, and he was terrified because he's like, I don't know what good alt text is. Like, I don't trust myself. I think it's really hard, first of all. So you're not alone in that, and finding ways that you can just like, again, go out and do it and really write like, what's the worst that's going to happen? If it's imperfect, you're still learning. And then just acknowledging the fact that part of that pressure and that nervousness is systemic. Right? We talk to a lot of people who don't have supports in their organization to experiment, right? Some accessibility straightforward, some accessibility, we don't know the answer. And oftentimes, or sometimes we were hearing, right, when people would get buy-in and they would like spend so much of their time fighting for this. And then they finally get it, and people are like, okay, I'm listening. What should I do? And when you're like, well, we can try this and this and this, they're like, no, like, give me a thing to do, or like, why have you been bothering me this whole time? Um, and again, some of that hostility, side note, is like one thing I want to dive into of whether groups are really that all groups are that hostile to each other, or it becomes part of this like where the communication breaks down. But regardless, right, there's not a lot of people seem to be in positions where there was not a lot of external support or validation for either iteration or learning, and so people were just like doing what they could. So I think some of it is that, getting connected to the accessibility communities, and, finding the resources, and, on a few great Slack channels that people just throw up those questions all the time. Some of it is just coming to terms that sometimes the answer is, I don't know. And like, here's my best effort solution. And I recognize that it is not perfect. And again, there will still be barriers for some people. But just then also that reflection that I think happens with a lot of people as they specialize of, right? You see how much you don't know, but you forget how much the people around you don't know even more. And sometimes people's minds are blown that blind people use computers. And so just like grounding yourself in the fact that, again, starting these conversations is a huge step, um, even if you don't always know the answer. So, but it is.
Right. And I think, like, you said, many of us, we had this moment where we first became aware of digital accessibility. And so giving people those moments is great.
Yeah.
Um, there were some comments as well related to what you just said about they were voluntold. They were basically like, oh, now you're responsible for this, right? It wasn't really their job, and they came into it, and kind of has its own set of challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that how people encounter accessibility, and again, this is another project we're working on of where people's, many people get like that viscerally like negative reaction to accessibility critiques as opposed to general design critiques, or someone who you like, right? All of design is deferring to guidelines and feedback to make good things, but accessibility is sometimes seen as more hostile. And just, yeah, this way that people usually either fall into it, and oftentimes in high stress situations, like, hey, we're about to get sued. Why don't you fix this?
Yeah.
No, you don't have any time or resources, okay, go. So yeah, that is a very real thing. The fact that there, even now, I think is not a lot of, there's a lot of resources, but nothing that really feels like, oh, I feel like a structured formal education. I'm like, I feel good about this, versus like you piece together what you can, seems to be still where a lot of people find themselves with accessibility.
So I was going to ask you a few of future further, research you're planning. You just kind of mentioned that. Is there kind of anything else that you want to share, or about other like follow-ups to this, or things that
Yeah,
questions you
so
want to ask? Yeah. So,
yeah, I think again, part of where I see this going in the future is a little bit into that, like, right, how can we start addressing this both in terms of its impact on burnout, and really what nuances do we get into of how to actually help people do accessibility. So some of my work has been like in small businesses where you get people who are like afraid to touch their Wix website at all because the internet might come down, let alone these accessibility things. So how do you I think like the discussion was going on the last talk about meeting people where they are. But then in this frame of burnout, really trying to dig into some of the like unique workarounds and things that people have done to make progress that I think really push beyond a lot of what at least I've seen in the academic sphere of either in these individual techniques or stuff like, oh, if the whole organization restructures, and you're like, yes, but it's not going to in the short term. Um, and those things of little tricks, like there was one person who told me a story of how he really shifted his culture because he realized that all of his developers came like were very grade focused in school and very competitive. That's how they ended up in these positions. And so he like got a little plastic trophy at the dollar store and filled it with candy. And whoever like did the most accessibility, whatever, would get this candy. And all of a sudden, like it was competitive. He got 15 minutes at their, OKR meetings. People were really excited about this little toy that they passed around. Just some of those like more, right, like what are your unhinged ways of getting
Right.
buy-in or taking care of yourself? And then again, some of those as well for the community of where else could we draw from, like, right, a lot of the rest is resistance stuff that came out of some of the social justice and racial justice movements, and drawing from some of those other activism spaces and again care worker spaces of what does it mean to help set ourselves up, that mentality of we can continue to care while also creating structures of rest, and respite. So a bang all over the place, but that's part of what, again, if you're interested, please fill out that form because those are kind of the conversations that I'm starting to spin up.
Could you clarify where they go to fill out that form?
Yes, so that is the burl.live/burnout or the QR code. That'll just take you to a Google form where you can give me your contact info and I'll keep you in the loop.
Okay. And there's a similar question to what you're talking about with, you kind of use that or someone used that with developers. But what about getting leadership buy-in? Because a lot of times they want to see like what's the strategic value, what's the message, data points. Leaders think just a little bit different.
Yeah, and I think that again is one of these things that comes into these role conflicts of people take on, again, sometimes these like very technical jobs or like QA jobs, and now all of a sudden are having to pitch to the CEO why this work is important. And so first of all, recognizing like if you're in that space and you're like, why are people asking me? Like you're not alone. Again, you do have knowledge, right? There's always kind of the three pillars that people talk about of making that human side, right? If you have anyone who has that personal connection, whether it is a customer, whether you can draw something that's really like you are affecting this person, right? Connecting that empathy. Right, you've got the data business side of, again, if you have any sense of like, oh, how many people are affected by this, or think really broadly about disabilities, or if we think about older adults, if we think about situational disabilities, things like that. And of course, the legal angle, especially with if you're someone who is associated with more government funding, that again, there's really great talks by quite a few people about this, of even though the Department of Justice might not be pushing things forward, that doesn't mean that lawsuits aren't still going to move forward. So I think there's those pillars, obviously. And then it is, yeah, just really, again, I think as came up in conversation before of the little wins still matter. The like, some of it is about getting the big leadership buy-in, but some of it's about like sneaking it into your own work. And then later you're like, oh, I did this and now we're here, right? Or the, again, the more, quote unquote, unhinged, versions of buy-in, as well as wrestling, again, just to acknowledge that some of this is hard, that some people are like, it feels really weird to use those personal stories because like, oh, are we getting into, accessibility porn of like really like, right, putting people on like, oh, you're helping this poor unfortunate person by da 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 da, like, or like, oh, do they know we're using their story in this way? Um, and just some of it's just kind of coming to terms with, right, we have the tools that we have available, and even though there's some of that conflict, again, sometimes it's just starting that conversation and being the squeaky wheel. And as I see in some of the comments, like sometimes it means sneaking it in, sometimes it means you turn around and all of a sudden you're in charge of accessibility even though you just got there. So